So I'm really very pleased to be able to um, share with you this fireside chat, the culmination of today's programming. And as you know, we have with us today Jeffrey Orridge. Jeffrey Orridge is the Chief Executive Officer of TV Ontario, which is the provincial educational television network. He's been in that post since November of 2020. Jeffrey previously served as the 13th Commissioner of the Canadian Football League, and he was the first African-American chief executive of a major North American sports league. I think you still hold that record to this date.
Yeah, regrettably, I am the first and the only. But we're looking to change that, aren't we?
Yes, yeah, we have some ground to cover. There are some other things that I would note from your biography, but I think rather than my reading through it, what I'd like to do is I would rather posit it as a question to get us going, because your bio gives us some key professional facts about who you are, the road you've traveled, but of course it doesn't tell us much about Jeffrey Orridge, the person. And because I know a lot about this story, just how inspiring it is, can you tell us a little bit about what I like to call the Orridge origin tale? Because you are a superhero. A little bit about yourself, your parents, growing up in New York City, surviving New York City, and your educational and professional aspirations before college, all of that sort of stuff.
Wow, that's a lot. Let me begin by saying thank you for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak. Having two teenage boys at home, it's always exciting for me to be in the company of anybody who has anything, any modicum of interest in anything I have to say these days. So thank you for that. I was born and raised in East Elmhurst, New York, which is about a mile from LaGuardia Airport. And I think the things that are significant to me about that, when I think about the way I was raised, is it was one of the few places back in the 1950s and 60s where Black people could actually have home ownership. They actually would sell homes, single-family homes, to Black people, and that was not always the case. And I think as a result, as I was growing up, it was a relatively mixed neighborhood. Blacks had been well established. It was mainly working class and middle class Black folks. And my parents, my father was for a long time a conductor on the New York City subway system, and my mother was a registered nurse and a psychiatric nurse. And I had an older brother and an older sister who were significantly older. So my parents were allowed to make all the mistakes on them, saving me, for all the good stuff. I think the other significant thing about East Elmhurst, oddly enough, it was not only an enclave for Black people to have home ownership, but by coincidence, I grew up in a house that was down the street from where Harry Belafonte used to live. And it was also around the corner from Malcolm X. And I can remember as a kid, several years after the bombing of Malcolm X's house, walking down that street, and I remember smelling the charred wood from that bombing that remained for years and years after that. And I used to play with Malcolm's kids. Eric Holder was also, from that neighborhood. So it was really kind of a rarefied experience. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think that definitely had an influence on the way I saw myself and the way I saw my community and the things that I wanted to do in my community as I was growing up, which probably inspired me to take the career path I had. My parents placed a premium on education. It was very important to them, so much so that they sent me to private school. And I remember the sacrifices that they had to make, although I was not fully conscious of it at the time. But I remember those fishless Fridays, those meatless Fridays, those times when they would forego going anywhere on vacation. And they would always tell me that they decided to do other things, but it was really to support my education at a private school. I went to collegiate school for boys in Manhattan. My classmates were people like literally John F. Kennedy Jr. It was a very elite private school, and I had a lot of advantages going there. I lived in Queens, so I had to take a bus and 3 trains to get there. And so it would take me over an hour, hour and a half at times. I leave my house before 7 in the morning, and I get home after 7 o'clock at night because I was also involved in sports. In the fall, it was football. In the winter, it was basketball. In the spring, it was baseball, and then it was track. So I was always involved in sports. But as a result, after practices or after games, it got very late. And the Upper West Side, where collegiate was located, was not the Upper West Side now, back then. After the train rides, it was 2 or 3 blocks of walking and stepping over, you know, the prostitutes and the drug addicts and the homeless people to get to this rarefied environment behind these red doors. So that also was oddly enough, an influence on how I looked at life, because I literally had to live in 2 worlds. And coming home from school, I lived across the street from a public school. And in a private school, you had to wear a jacket and tie. And I remember that I was the subject of being chased many times when I was on my way home, because there was a resentment from public school kids that here was this private school kid who wore glasses. And I think, candidly, the only thing that saved me is I was a pretty good athlete. So I was a good basketball player, and I was known in the neighborhood. And so whenever people would, you know, try to confront me, there were other people who were like, no, that's the professor. He's cool. So,
and when that failed, you ran track.
And right. So that also helped me in my track career later on in college. Absolutely. But no, I think, you know, it was a rarefied environment.
Yeah.
And it was rarefied because it was a balance between a predominantly Black environment and an almost exclusively white environment.
Yeah.
Working class folks in my family and my friends and my community, and then interacting with a very elite, small level of population.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, you know, my background, you know, prior to college, but it also, you know, obviously enabled me to go to a place like Amherst and be relatively comfortable in an environment like that,
yeah,
where you really had to be very adaptable.
Yeah. So you were really forged in a very special part of the crucible of the 1960s. You know, that place we were at, majority society was only beginning to intersect with Black society. Depending on your perspective, Black society only beginning to intersect with white society. And it puts you in a place of not only being able to bridge these gaps, like you said, ultimately to go to Amherst, but also to take on positions of leadership, and for leadership responsibilities to be thrust upon you. Did that have any impact on your choices as to, I mean, obviously through your parents, you were definitely going to go to college. Did that have any impact on your ultimate selection in choosing Amherst over other opportunities?
I think you make a really good point. So not going to college was never an option.
Yeah.
That was never discussed in the family, right? My brother had gone to college. My sister actually went to Howard University and graduated from here. So that was never really an option. I think the other thing that was interesting is I mentioned, you know, my parents placed a premium on education, and they were born in an era of segregation. Mm-hmm. And raised even in the Northeast, even in New York City, with, you know, fairly blatant discrimination and segregation. And I think I had always, what had been instilled in me early on, particularly by my father, was the fact that I would have to over-index. There would be a disproportionate amount of emphasis on working harder, being more capable, being more able than my counterparts to have the same opportunities. And even then, you were not guaranteed to have the same opportunities. So that was kind of the motivation and the inspiration, and one of the guiding forces that that kind of steered me to going to a school like Amherst College. And I have to be honest, when I was at Collegiate, which was a pipeline to elite colleges, I remember the guidance counselor told me that I should not set my sights that high, that Amherst would be a stretch and a reach. But there were other schools in the Midwest that were almost as good, that would certainly provide a great education for me. But in many ways, subconsciously, no, I wouldn't even say subconsciously, I'd say covertly, I was steered towards not the Ivies, not Amherst, not Williams, not those elite high reach schools, but other places. And my father was determined that I was going to continue that pursuit of excellence, and go to the best school that I could. And at the time, Amherst was the most selective school in the country because it was the smallest. There were only 1,500 in the student body, as opposed to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, and that you would actually get, one-on-one teaching, as opposed to your introductory classes being one of many in a lecture hall. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to go to Amherst, because I really wanted to stretch and learn and grow. And also, I knew that I needed those credentials to get me to that next level, whatever that next level would be.
Yeah, yeah. So with all of this, with this clear sense of responsibility, this clear sense of initially limited options, but then creating new pathways and new options for yourself, you go to Amherst, you're successful at Amherst, and you make what would be an almost obvious decision to go to law school where you can implement these things. And you end up at some small law school called Harvard Law School. While you were at Harvard, what would you say, looking back, what aspects of your law school education would you say best prepared you for the professional life that you actually had, the actual positions? Because, we go to law school and we all think we're going to be, Thurgood Marshall or, whatever. And then, you actually are in practice. And when you look back on the things that you actually did, the actual positions that you had, were there any aspects of law school that you say, okay, that was particularly helpful or particularly useful, even if I didn't think so at the time? Looking back, were there any aspects of the Harvard experience that were useful in that way?
Yeah, I think holistically, when I think about the fact that you gain the knowledge and the opportunities to apply yourself to social injustice causes, and that you have the knowledge and awareness to do something for others. Because the other thing is, my father was a huge fan of Muhammad Ali. And I know that they had met each other in their lives. And I remember the quote that my father would tell me from Muhammad Ali. It was, your service to others is the rent that you pay for your room on this earth. So I think that was a guiding principle. When you go to Amherst, you're exposed to William Hastie and Charles Hamilton Houston. And those are your models, and those are your ideals, and that is your aspiration. So that's the other thing that influences you. I had classmates who influenced me, like Lateef Mtima, who, and I say this in all sincerity, and this was not rehearsed, that, you inspired me as well as other of our classmates in the way you thought about things and your approach to things. So I think that was all kind of the foundation to get me to law school. So what I gleaned from law school, aside from the critical thinking skills, aside from the analysis, aside from problem solving, aside from the leadership, the competitiveness that you are constantly challenged in pushing that envelope, I think you also develop a sense of humility. And as good as you think you are and as you're trying to be, you also recognize that you're not perfect, that there are people who are superior to you that you can learn from and be encouraged by. And that's a key driver. So I think, you know, aside from those skill sets that you learn in law school and a heightened level of social consciousness, you also develop a better sense of yourself. And probably through a natural maturation period, you refine what you believe your purpose is. And then you're able to use, I've been able to use all of those skills that I acquired in law school later in my life, in my career. And part of it is perspective. Yeah. Law school teaches you perspective, to look at things from several different angles. Yeah. Because surely if you look at things from enough different angles, surely you'll find one that you like.
Yes.
Right? But that's what law school trains you to do.
Yes.
To see several different sides in several different dimensions and imagine things differently.
Yeah.
And so that also fosters your creativity. When I was thinking about lawyers, I used to think they were one-dimensional. I think they were purely analytical. And I said, I don't really want to be a lawyer because I'm far too creative.
Yeah.
And I'm far too expansive a thinker. And then I realized that law school actually promoted the creativity in that part of my brain, the marketing aspect, and putting deals together and seeing how things worked differently in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad we're having this talk, because I've known you for over 40 years and I'm learning things about you right now. Well, you went to college when you were 5.
Right. Thank you.
You know, that's what happens. We're prodigies. Because one thing I never completely understood, I was aware of, but I didn't understand, like, how did you do that? You have obviously, from the time we were in college together and subsequently in your career, you blended your sense of social justice responsibility with your interest in law and leadership, and with your passion for sports and your innate capability as an athlete. So all of these things come together. How would you say you have been able to implement that sort of mélange of skills and capabilities in your professional life? Because you've obviously had some positions that you could have approached just simply as, hey, I'm the guy who represents this sports franchise, or I'm the guy who represents these entertainers. But you obviously have not approached it in such a one-dimensional way.
Yeah, I think I'm guided by my faith in a lot of ways, and I believe that that we're all multidimensional, and that given the support that I've been given throughout my life, that I really had a responsibility and an obligation to take the talents and the gifts that I've been given and to maximize them. If I think about my role as a CEO, my job is to optimize resources, right? Yeah. So I've been trying to do that all my life with myself, I would imagine, now that I reflect on it. Just optimizing those resources and knowing, I mean, I was a fairly high level athlete, to at least the extent that I could, play varsity basketball as a freshman in college. I played I played 4 or 5 sports at a time. But I was also given, certain, I guess, inherent abilities, intellectual capacity to absorb a lot of different things and synthesize them relatively quickly. So I think it gave me the platform to do that. So I was inspired by the people who I knew supported me and had expectations of me, and also the expectations I had of myself. And I never thought of myself as one dimension.
So this leads me to another sort of incremental question, because I realized what I just did was I sort of jumped over a step, because I now understand, like, the why of your going from your initial experiences, growing up in New York, getting the skill set in college and law school, and then putting this all together in terms of the types of positions that you've held in sports, in entertainment, and in tech. But what I left over, I just realized, is that we haven't discussed the how. Because as we look at your bio, when you graduated from law school, you weren't doing that type of work. Okay. And as many of the students in our audience here and in our audience out in the cyber ether, when you get out of law school, you probably are not going to be doing these types of cool jobs that you have had. And so there's going to be a need for you to figure out how to navigate from, for example, you started out at Rogers and Wells. I remember that because we were in the same building.
Right, that's right.
Right, we were in the old Pan Am building, which is, what is it now, MetLife?
Right.
Right, okay, and you were in Rogers and Wells and I was upstairs at the Kudir Brothers. And what sort of work were you doing there? Was it transactional?
I was doing transactional work. I was doing leverage buyouts, revolving credit facilities, mergers and acquisitions.
Really exciting stuff. How do you go from, leverage buyouts, M&A, which was the 80s. And of course, the leverage buyouts was the thing.
It was a thing.
Right, it was the thing back then. How do you go from that to the types of positions that are on your in your Wikimedia bio, which I thought was just so cool? Like you're in Wikimedia, it's like, wow, right? Like I know this dude. How did you go from exciting leverage buyout work to get to do the types of things that this audience and our audience outside are really interested in? Because those are the things that they want to do.
How?
Yeah.
Divine intervention. Everybody has a plan.
Yeah.
Like Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So I always had a passion for sport. I always knew that at some point I wanted to make a career out of sport. But I also realized that when I didn't get that growth spurt that my mom had promised me, that I had to probably figure how to do something else. But that was always a key driver and a motivator. And I made the decision after almost 3 years practicing law and corporate law that this is not what I wanted to do anymore in my life, that this was not part of my purpose. I wasn't suited for it. And I think that when I made that decision, and it was not an easy decision to make because many people said, well, if you're not a lawyer, then what are you? And Jeffrey, you've invested all this time and this effort and this energy and this money that you have to pay back, these student loans you've amassed. And if you're not going to be a lawyer, what else can you do? What else are you qualified for? So I think what I had to do was, search within inside myself and muster the courage to take a leap and just figure it out and figure out something else and pursue the things that I had wanted to do, and no longer to be defined by what other people thought of me or what other people's expectations of me were, or what people expected me to have and to do and to become, and rather to think about what I wanted to become in my life. And I think once I made that decision, things opened up and things started happening for me. But I was prepared as well. I mean, I did have some credentials. I did have some relationships. I had been involved in sport tangentially. I had been an athlete. So it was those kinds of, I think the network that was built that I wasn't cognizant of at the time that actually put me in the right place at the right time for these opportunities. But I can't tell you there was a blueprint. Yeah. And that was sport. Yeah. But, Lateef, I've done a lot of different things in my career. I've primarily in sport, but it was sports law, and then it was sports marketing. And then it was putting deals together. And then it was, I was the CEO of, back then it was called a .com. And clearly what
happened to those?
Well, if it had worked out for me, I probably would be speaking to you from my private island in the South Pacific instead of right here. But yeah, that evolved into the internet. But I think, when you get out of law school, you and I both know you do not know how to practice law.
That's right. That's
right.
Yeah.
So you have to get over that initial fear of not knowing exactly what to do, and making missteps and faltering, but not allowing those missteps or those mistakes to define you not allowing other people to define you because of those missteps and mistakes, and just deciding that you're going to pursue what your passion is.
Yeah.
But obviously you have to have things in place, and you can't do it alone, because they say 87% of your self-talk is negative self-talk. And I'm not sure how they got to that, but I'm 87% sure they're right. But that's the first thing that you have to overcome. Yeah. And then I think you have to have a support system and people who have confidence in you and faith in you, even when the faith in yourself falters. Yeah. And that's, and that buoys you and allows you to take some risks. Yeah. Right. There's somebody, Rollo May, in the 1960s said that courage is not the opposite of cowardice. It is the opposite of conformity. So by doing things differently, by taking a chance, by taking some risks, it allows you to explore and learn other things. Yeah. I've been a lifelong learner. Yeah. Every job that I've had, whether it's in law or marketing or media or sports or technology or entertainment or consumer products, it's always been a learning experience, and not being afraid to continue to learn.
So I have a particular question I want to ask you, but I want to make sure I've got this right, because what I'm hearing you say is, you can't predict the path, but that some of the critical elements to the path is that first and foremost, you got to get your skill set. Secondly, you have to pay your dues. Those first couple of years, you were doing stuff that it wasn't exactly what killed you, right?
Right.
But you understood the need and the learning that could take place. And then once you got to that point, right, that you had pulled together some skills, you paid your dues, then came the crossroads. Am I going to just conform? Am I going to do the easy, follow the path that people have set out? Or am I going to take some risk? And the thing with risk means risk is not, I get to do what I want to do without consequences, right? I get to do what I want, but I still have a really nice car, a really nice home, enough money to eat out all the time. No. It might not work out that way. And there may be this period in between. And if you put all those things together, get the skills, pay the dues, then have the courage to take genuine risk, then things will come to you and you will be ready to see them and to accept them. Does that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The preparation is hard.
Yeah.
It's a grind. Yeah. And I wasn't one of the reasons why I went to Amherst is because it was an extraordinarily rigorous academic program. So I knew it was going to be easy. Reason why I went to Harvard is because it was hard. But you do those things, you climb those steps. You don't expect to be parachuted onto the mountaintop. Yeah. You can't take the elevator to the 20th floor.
Right.
Because as you climb those steps, you build up those muscles.
Yes.
And it's not all sunshine. Yeah. There were some dark days.
Yeah.
There were some days that I didn't feel like getting out of bed. Yeah. There were some days that I just didn't want to do the work. Yeah. And it can be a grind. But all those things prepare you for when you do get some success, because you also know what it's like not to be successful. Right. And you also recognize how fortunate you are and that you are not there by dint of your own being, that there are other forces, that there are other people, that there are other circumstances that have conspired to put you in the place that you are so that you can do the things that you want to do. And you can't always do the things you want to do. Right. I'm the CEO of an organization, and in the C-suite, that actually means you have to deal with conflict, controversy, and criticism. That's what C stands for. Right. Right. So, and that's in any leadership position that you are going to be subject to that on a regular basis. And part of it is just developing a thick enough skin and having the confidence within yourself and having a support system that will enable you to keep going in those dark days when you feel oppressed, because you will be betrayed.
Mm-hmm.
People will lie to you. People will discriminate against you. People will not give you opportunities that you know you are well deserving of. But my father told me early on, because he grew up in an era of segregation, where he was in World War II and he had to walk behind the trains. The black GIs had to walk behind the trains of the German POWs, where he had to eat behind the restaurant where they put the garbage. So he told me that your life will not be comfortable all the time, but you have the opportunity to not only do better for yourself, but to do better for other people. And that is now your responsibility, because you've been given these privileges. You've been given things that your father, never had. So I think, there was an additional burden, if you call it, obligation, responsibility that you feel is imputed. And you have a choice. And although I never really thought I had a choice, I thought that this was an obligation. Yeah.
Tell us about the experience of the Dream Team, and you know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
So that was interesting, because there was no Dream Team when I started with USA Basketball. I joined USA Basketball in 1991. The Dream Team actually emerged as the Olympic basketball representative for the United States in '92. And it was the first time that professional basketball players were allowed to compete in the Olympics. And that was on the heels of the United States losing the gold medal in 1988. And they figured, well, we're playing against professionals all over the world, even though they're not designated as professionals. And we're putting college players up against these professionals. So it was out of nationalistic pride. And it was also about commercialization and money, that they figured we had to do something different. But the goal was to entice NBA players to actually compete in the Olympics, which was unpaid. Now, some of the challenges were that these were franchise players. These were Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. And the owners would be reticent to allow their players to compete outside of, the regular season, because what if they got injured? That could mean the end of their franchise. So there's a financial disincentive for owners to endorse it. There was disincentive for players to actually get involved, because they had a long regular season, and the summertime was the time that they could rest and spend time with their family and their friends. So it was disincentive for them. USA Basketball was sponsored by Converse. But each of these individual players, with the exception of Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, were with other shoe companies. Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley were with Nike. And, Karl Malone was with LA Gear, and Clyde Drexler was with Avia. So you have those inherent endorsement licensing contracts. So there's a lot going on. Reebok sponsored the award suit for the Olympics. That was in conflict with a lot of the shoe company endorsements. So it was a very intricate, complex set of negotiations that we had to do to get to what ultimately became the Dream Team. But the first thing that I had to do when I was hired as general counsel, and I was the first general counsel at USA Basketball, was to negotiate with the NBA to do a joint venture agreement that we would share in the marketing and the licensing and have the same risk together. So this is the first deal I worked on with the NBA. Magic Johnson decided, I'm in. I want to do this for my country. And he had a significant amount of leverage and sway with his team. So then he called his best friend, Larry Bird, and said, hey, Larry, let's do this. Larry was in. So they realized that they had to get Michael Jordan to actually turn the needle. So when Jordan was in, then every NBA player petitioned to want to be on this Dream Team. And so that's hence the Dream Team, right? And that's what we know in, as far as I'm concerned, the first and only Dream Team. But it was, these guys were legends.
Yeah.
But it was very intricate, complex set of negotiations and deal making. Yeah. And for me, early in my legal career, it was incredible experience. When I look back on it now, had I known what would be involved, I would not have thought that I was capable of being in that position.
Yeah.
I would have probably, in the back of my mind, that negative self-talk would have said, I'm not ready for this. I'm not prepared. I don't know enough.
Yeah.
I will fail. But because I didn't know what was involved, you just kind of did it. You got into it and you did it. So that was kind of the dream team experience. And that was really my first foray into sports law. And then on the heels of that, I was recruited by Reebok to be counsel for worldwide marketing and advertising. But within 6 months of that job, because I was helping the business people put the elite athlete endorsement deals together and the league deals together, I was doing the lion's share of the work. The president of Reebok asked me to take over global sports marketing, to become director of global sports marketing. So I was responsible for all of the sports and all of the elite athlete endorsement agreements, ranging from Shaquille O'Neal to Maradona in soccer, to Emmitt Smith in football, to baseball players, and then helping to negotiate the Atlanta Olympic deal with Reebok and the first NBA, the landmark NBA Reebok deal. So incredible amount of experience and really high level work because I was in the right place at the right time, not because I was more capable than other people.
Well, I don't know about that, but is it fair to say that in effect what you did in putting together this dream team, because it's really more about the structure that you put together. You know, we all get to see the team playing, but the team that would never have occurred until you put this structure together. You've got the corporate entities behind each of the players that have conflicting business interests. And so what you had to do, is it fair to say what you did is you had to create the business model that before you map it out for them, this looks to each corporate entity as this is something that I don't want to do. In fact, I can't do it because this is going to eat into my commercial interests. And somehow or another, you have to craft for them a structure for this that shows them that, no, actually you want a piece of this.
Right. So really the visionary behind this was David Stern. He was the commissioner of the NBA at the time, and Russ Granick, who was the deputy commissioner. They were convinced to grow the game of basketball, you had to export it. And they convinced everyone else, the owners, the players, those who were already invested in basketball, that by creating global awareness by with these players, it would ultimately result in growing the pie, and it would be a bigger pie for everyone. Because most of the corporations that were already NBA sponsors had a global footprint. You know, the Coca-Colas of the world, the McDonald's of the world. So they were able to convince that. And it would grow the pie. And the more basketball grew, the more products would be consumed worldwide. There would be more basketballs bought, more sneakers bought, more basketball rims and equipment bought, more television rights would want to be acquired by other broadcasters around the globe. So it benefited everyone. So I think, once again, it's all a matter of how you look at something. Right? Your perspective. And, you know, so Hamlet, right? Nothing is either good nor bad. Only thinking it makes it so. Right? Act 2, Scene 2, Hamlet, right? So, but the whole point of that.
Amherst?
Yeah, I went to Amherst. So, but as a liberal arts major, clearly, right? I studied some English. So, but the point is that it all depends on your perspective. If you turn something around, then it may not be what is obvious to the uninformed. Right? So the more information you get, the more perspective you have and the different angles you can see. So really, I was, you know, look, it was the NBA. They were the architects. They had the vision. They knew what the horizon could look like. And I happened to be in the right place at the right time representing USA Basketball to actually help them with the vision. But I saw the vision too.
Yeah.
I bought into it. And so that made me, because I had the passion behind it and I was aligned with their vision, I think it made me a lot more effective with doing the job that I needed to do.
You were the one with the boots on the ground who had to make it so as the lawyer. In fact, what you say, it reminds me of something that the CEO from a major company many years ago, this was about, say, 15 years ago, we were talking about getting major corporate entities to buy in to what we were calling back at that time diversity. Today we call it, inclusivity. The names have to change to keep up with the times, whatever. But he was giving us a talk, and he was saying that when he first pitches to law firms, that, well, I need you to figure out a way to do better in terms of diversity recruitment. And he says, whenever the law firms would come back to them, the way that initially some of these corporate entities might come back and say, well, I don't want to do this. This is not good. This is impossible. He said, whenever law firms would come to him and say, here are all the reasons as to why we can't do this, right? There aren't enough of them in the pipeline. They aren't bright enough, blah, blah, blah. He'd listen to him and then he'd say, okay, great, next, because I don't hire lawyers to tell me what the problems are. I hire lawyers to tell me how to solve my problems. And so what you're telling me is that you can't solve my problems, which means I'm not speaking to the right lawyer, right? And so what they recognized in you and your work was, here's the vision. And what you had to do was you explained to these prospective potential clients, this is why this is good for you. This is how this gets over your problems and actually turns this into something good.
Right. It's not cannibalization. It's actually, and it's not competitive. It's complementary.
Exactly.
Right. We grow the pie. It
Exactly.
doesn't eat into the pie. We grow the pie.
Exactly. Well, I want to ask you one question while I give folks in the audience a chance, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to, if somebody has a question, I'm going to bring you the mic. And so while I'm walking over, in the meantime, while it takes me time to get over there, we talked about those issues at that time that presented opportunities. Are there, in the current contemporary sports, technological, entertainment, network, the landscape we're looking at today, are there any special issues, opportunities, concerns that you think about in this landscape, particularly for communities that have been traditionally on the outside, traditionally underserved? Because certainly there was an element to that of dealing with that in a positive way in terms of that whole dream team situation. And we have all kinds of new issues, new technological opportunities, and the exploitations, et cetera, et cetera. So are there things like that that you would talk about? And while you're answering, I'm going to take the mic over to, because I already see some hands. Who has it first?
Yeah, I think I think the landscape has become so much more complex with the advent of technology and the pace of change that technology is inspiring. But the same issues that we were facing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s are some of those same fundamental issues that we're facing today. Exclusion, not inclusion. Education, in theory, being the great equalizer, but in many ways, it's the great divider. It separates the us from them. When you don't have the same access to educational opportunities, and then subsequently the same access to professional opportunities as a result to being denied educational opportunities that could better prepare you. So I think we still have those same challenges. I think that there is more of an opportunity to widen that chasm based on the digital divide that historically overlooked, underserved, underprivileged communities are still not having the same access to technology, the same educational opportunities in tech. So consequently, they can't create a value proposition for those who are hiring. But as a result, the technology has allowed us to be our own content creators. So there's a democratization of content creation in a lot of ways. So we no longer have to rely on the traditional gatekeepers in terms of getting those music contracts, in terms of making that next film, and having access to ways to commercialize our art and our creative content. So I think that has helped us a great deal. The social media, the internet has expanded opportunities. And at the same time, we have to be very wary and very conscious of those entities that will continue to try to exploit those who don't have access to the information and the knowledge, and the expertise that can help and support and promote. So I think that's where we are right now. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. But my feeling is we have to embrace technology now more than ever and figure out how to utilize it as being content creators. And we know historically that folks of color have set trends in music, in art, in fashion, right? I mean, I grew up at the advent of hip hop. I grew up in Queens. Russell Simmons was from Queens. I met Andre Harrell through Russell Simmons, and Andre did Uptown Records. And Puffy, Sean Combs was Andre's intern. And he was here at Howard undergrad for a little while. So during that era, though, what I'm getting to, it was the advent of a whole global cultural shift where Black art and Black entertainment was being recognized on a global scale and influencing every part of this planet. And you can see it represented everywhere. So I think, once again, we also have to be conscious of how to protect our creation, how to protect our content, because historically it has been stolen, right? I mean, think about all the music that were covers. They were essentially covers of songs that Black artists created and white artists recorded and were promoted, and Black artists never even got the recognition. People didn't even know that it was originally created by Black artists, much less that it was a cover, a replicant.
Hi, Mr. Orridge. Met you in class earlier today, but for everyone, my name is Christine Crosdale. I'm a fourth-year JD MBA here at Howard. Thank you so much for sharing just about your trajectory, and even something that you mentioned earlier in class was the difference between IQ, EQ, but what you said is the new thing that our generation needs to be more adept in, which is our AQ, adaptability quotient. I would love to know more about that aspect, but particularly with regards to your adaptability in entering the Canadian Football League. What did that look like in terms of adapting from your experience here in the United States? I know it's still North America, but totally different country. And just how are you able to also bring what you also talked about, your realness, your authenticity there, while not trying to impose upon what their value sets are?
It's a really good and complex question. Thank you for that. As I said, earlier, that there have been tests for decades on IQ. And now they're even testing EQ, right? That emotional quotient. But what we are tested on, but there is no measure for, is AQ, adaptability quotient. And I think now more than ever, we are going to need to expand that level of skill set and consciousness to be adaptable and adjustable, because the pace of change is happening so quickly. And because we live in a global society, in a global environment where there are so many different cultures. So I moved up to Canada about 17 years ago. to take a job with a not-for-profit. It was a global humanitarian organization called Right to Play. And we worked in 26 different countries where the Human Development Index was so abysmally low, they didn't even have running water. And so that was an adjustment. And that was the first time that I was immersed in those kinds of communities and environments that I had only previously seen on National Geographic. And so it's cool to say, you know what, I really want to help people and I really want to do something important and I really want to give and these people really want help. So I need to go to Africa. And then when you're there, it's a totally different experience and it changes your world. And I can tell you, I went to a township in Liberia. It's called West Point. And this place is a place that is run by the robbers and the thieves and the criminals in Liberia. And it's kind of their sanctuary, right? They go out, they rob, steal, plunder, pillage, and they come back to West Point. And in order to work in that community, you have to get permission from the chief, which is kind of a scary thing, right? So I go in. What helps me is the color of my skin. What also helps me is I have a Canadian passport because there's an antagonism towards the US. So it gets to one of the things that I want to talk about, some cultural, territorial antagonisms that have been set up over time that you may or may not be aware of, but you have to be aware of. And it's not just domestically, it is internationally. So be prepared for that because you all will be in a global environment and you'll be dealing with people outside of your local community, many of you. So anyway, so I go into West Point. Chieftain says, okay, it's cool. So we set up this school. The school has about 30 kids in a space that's about 10 by 10 with one blackboard, one piece of chalk. There's no books. And it's located at the end of a raw sewage dump. And the floors are dirt floors and it's corrugated metal roof. So when it rains, it comes onto the mud. The muddy floors run into the raw sewage river. The raw sewage river backs up into the schoolroom. And they didn't have chairs. They sat on used car battery cases. And these kids came to school every single day because they had something to look forward to, they had something to do, and they had something to love. And so when you work in an environment like that, it changes you. And when you come back to a place like Canada or the US, you are changed forever in ways that I can't even articulate. But that further develops your AQ, that adaptability quotient, because now you have to adjust back to not an emerging country, but to a developed country. And then you have to adapt to people who don't just want to give, but people who want to take. And you're in a highly competitive environment at that point. I start at the CFL. I am the first and only commissioner of a major sports league in North America. I don't look like much of the paying patrons, the consumers of the league. I don't talk like the Canadians. I don't dress like Canadians. I don't have a Canadian perspective, regardless of having lived in the country for years and in becoming a citizen. I think that oftentimes you're in the right place at the wrong time. Sometimes you can be in the right job at the right place and the wrong time. You can be in the wrong job in the right place and the right time. You get what I'm saying. I think one of the things that was particularly challenging is there was a presumption when I came in, he's American. He's never played Canadian football. He doesn't understand who we are and the values of this league that's been around for 60 years. But there's code in there too. There's code, there are things unspoken. The media that I got, there's a lot of code in the articles that they wrote. And sometimes they would disguise sports journalism was really sports opinion. And it wasn't about investigative facts. It was about, I don't really like this guy. I don't know what he's doing. Because he's American. Because he's other. Because he's different. So part of what I had to do is navigate that. Frankly, I was surprised that I got the job, even though I knew I was the most qualified person. I applaud the owners for hiring me because they based it on meritocracy. They didn't base it on fandom. But those are the things that all businesses, ultimately balance. And sometimes things won't always work out, and it may not be by virtue of what you do or don't do. It's the prevailing circumstances. But you got to adapt and adjust. And when it doesn't work out, you got to pivot and figure out how to do something else and something different. So, subsequently, as you know, I left the league after a couple of years because fundamentally, my vision of where I wanted the league to go and the owner's vision were just not aligned. But I changed the brand when I was there. I grew revenue by 39%. I increased the female demographic by 8%. I increased the youth demographic by 7%. I did all the things that I was supposed to do, that I was hired to do. But that's not always recognized in the way that you would want it to be.
Hey, Mr. Orridge. We met earlier today. My name is Perry Jackson, 2L here at Howard. But during our conversation earlier, you mentioned a lot about your cross-border transactions. That you mentioned working, obviously with Canada, Chinese lawyers or attorneys, and also Japanese. So I was just wondering, are there any interesting or useful developments in the fields of IP in any of those other countries that you think could be useful to inform IP in America, for example, particularly in Canada?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think it dovetails on the earlier question about cultural differences. And the cultural differences oftentimes inform business practices. And, the things that are applicable here in the US don't necessarily always translate globally. And I think that's what you've got to examine, right? What is customary? What is the practice? What is the law in those particular territories? So candidly, I couldn't comment on the things on a spate of commonalities or the spate of differences, but I think they are country by country. And it all depends on what you're looking at. I mean, there are certain basic tenets in terms of protecting rights and protecting ownership, but that also varies in terms of your perspective. What is protectable? What are you entitled to? We have different entitlements and different expectations in the US than they do in China, which is different from India, which is vastly different from Russia. And I've been to 64 countries, and many of them more than once, and I've done business in the majority of them. And I have to say there are more similarities than differences, but there are definitely unique differences that you have to pay attention to. For example, I was negotiating setting up a right-to-play branch in China. You remember the negotiation probably took 3 or 4 times longer than it would have. One is because of the translation, but the other thing is in China, there are certain words that we have in the US that don't exist in the Chinese language, like cooperation. Literally, the word cooperation, there was no direct translation for it in China.
One of the reasons as to why students here would ask the question why Perry is in the copyright class, because that is something that we discuss all the time, that what an IP protection system is going to do in a society is directly dependent upon, well, what are the expectations that a society has, you know? And so clearly your cultural values, you know, I mean, obviously in the United States, for example, we have a big cultural value in freedom of speech, right? So our expectations of the IP system are going to be in some places subordinate to that. And so, yeah, the whole idea of understanding the cultural values and expectations of a society are certainly going to shape. We only have time really for one question that came from the group, from the chat, because we have people watching us. We had a couple, but the one that stands out the most, that is maybe one of the best things to end on, and that question was, how would you advise, or maybe even how would you for yourself today, because as you said, you're a lifelong learner, but how would you advise students in going out and choosing mentors?
Great question. You want to choose mentors. You don't want to choose just one. That's the first thing. You want to have several people. You want to identify people who are doing and have experience and an expertise in what you are hoping to do, so you can learn from them. You also want to have mentors who are doing things very different than what that other area of focus is, because once again, it helps you shape your perspective because they come at it from a different lens, right? So you want to have several different inputs that are not necessarily all aligned, because it helps you formulate your opinions, and it goes to critical thinking and thinking outside of the box, and being able to adapt and adjust more quickly because you have different inputs. I think the other thing that you have to establish, and I mentioned this earlier, is you have to establish your network of friends. And friends come from three things, I believe. Trust. You have to develop a trust, a mutual trust. You have to feel that somebody has your back. And you feel that somebody has your back, and they know you have your, and you know they have their back. You know you have their back. When you do what you say you're going to do. So they trust that you're reliable, you're dependable. People will give you more when they know they can trust you. The second thing is authenticity. You got to be real with people. You have to establish that level of connection, because people feel that you're going to be honest with them. And I think the third is shared experiences, right? When you can relate to someone and they can relate to you because you have some common experiences that you can that you can talk about. So those things create a connectivity and a bond where mentors will lean in and support you, because people are very busy. So, and it's a two-way street. You've got to not only want to be mentored, but the mentor has to want to mentor you. So that's what I would recommend, that you identify those people who are doing what you want to do ultimately, because there is somewhat of a blueprint that they've already established, and they can, help you navigate sometimes some very treacherous waters. But you also want to engage people from the outside who can perhaps give you another perspective.
Yeah, because mentoring takes time. So you got to make sure that your prospective mentor has a reason as to why would I want to mentor you, right? Okay, there are 30 other perspectives who would like to take some of my time. Well, speaking of time, I think that we could spend here for a few more hours, and obviously you and we could talk for the rest of the evening. We probably will. But why don't you all join me in thanking Jeff Orridge for being with us today.
Thank you.